Tātou e hui nei ki runga I te reo karanga, warahiri mai tātou I tēnei ata. Tēnei te reo o Toi Mai, e mihi atu nei ki a koutou. Koutou kua hono mai, wiwi mai wā, marunga ipurangi ki tēnei hui topa a tātou. Nā reira māku e whakawātea ai tēnei hui huinga, whakataki au tētahi karakia, kia whakapai ai ngā kōrero, ngā wānanga kei mui a tātou. Nā reira ka karakia tātou. Te urunga tū, te urunga tapu, te mauri tū, te mauri tapu, te mauri te whiwhia, te mauri te rawea, te mauri no hea no rangi no nuku tū. Tēnei te mauri ka whakapiki, tēnei te mauri ka whakakake, te mauri o ngā atua, e rangi whakaputa ki te whai iau ki te ao marama. Whano, haramai te toki, haimi e hui e, tā iki e. Kia ora mai tātou katoa. Sorry about the irony of being the organisation that looks after technology and we can't even get our technology right ourselves. Hoi no, I think that's a tohu for a great start so far. So I'll throw it over to Claire and she can take over and hopefully we don't have any more echoes.
Put your thing on. Kia ora tama. For people who don't know, Tama is the paumatua of Toi Mai, ko Claire Robinson toku ingoa, ko Ota Tumu or Toi, the Chief Executive of the Toi Mai Workforce Development Council, and it is great to see you all here on our webinar with Gillian Dudgeon from the Tertiary Education Commission to talk about the government's proposals for vocational reform. I'll hand over to Gillian in a second. But I just wanted to set some context for Gillian more than anything else, but possibly for some other people here in the room. Over the last 3 weeks, we've done quite a bit of engaging as Toi Mai with our industries around the government's vocational reform proposals, and they, especially as they relate to what happens when workforce development councils are replaced in the new system. And I think it's probably fair to say that there's quite a bit of disappointment, which I think, Gillian, you will expect, disappointment amongst many of our industries that are represented here about the possible structures that are listed in the consultation document of industry training boards and standard setters that do not list the Toi Mai industries apart from hair and beauty. I think there's disappointment that the options 2A and B about replacing workforce development councils favour the older industries with traditional forms of apprenticeship rather than the newer industries that we represent that haven't yet had the opportunity to develop fit-for-purpose work integrated learning options, which don't fit under the old apprenticeship structure so easily. Disappointment that the option is to be sent over to NZQA as a holding pen when many of the barriers that our industries face in setting up that form of training are the very rules that New Zealand qualifications authorities established to defend. And I think that there are some questions circulating around our industries around option 2A, thinking that those who do not have established apprenticeships might use that as the opportunity to set up their own industry training boards, even though they don't have apprenticeships or internships or work integrated learning sophisticated models yet, but this might be an opportunity. So I'd like you to talk about the limitations of 2A in that regard. Otherwise, you're going to get a lot of submissions saying, set me up as an industry training board, please. So with that context, I will pass the rākau over to Gillian, who has a presentation that she will give, and then we'll open it up for questions. Kia ora, thank you.
Mihi, Claire. Tēnā koutou katoa ko aorangi mai inarangi ngā whenua o Okutupuna no whakatū oho ko Gillian Dudgeon toko ingoa hei tumanaki tuaroa aho kei te amarangi mataranga matua mo te ropo toko rotonga no reira. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So hi everyone. Yep, I'm not surprised by your list of questions there, Claire. So I will run through the full presentation, but then happy to take all the questions, and I'll try to respond to some of those things as I work through. So look, it is really important that we have a strong vocational system And the government does want to hear everyone's views, and Claire obviously articulated that for your industries, there are some very important views that you're going to want to put forward in terms of your feedback. And I recognise that this is a really challenging time and a difficult time. And I just want to thank especially Claire and her team as we work through the changes, and that they support all of your industries as we navigate our way through this period of uncertainty and change. So like vocational education and training supports 250,000 students, apprentices and trainees at the moment. And when the current government came in at the end of last year, they made two really critical decisions which have informed the consultation. The first was the decision to disestablish Tipakinga, and the second was the reprioritisation of the $65 million worth of funding that is currently used to support workforce development councils. So those are decisions that have already been taken. To ensure that we continue to have a successful vocational and education and training system, it does need to be responsive to local needs. It has to have industry buy-in, and the whole system needs to be financially viable. So this means that every part of the system needs to be viable. And you'll hear a lot of media commentary about the financial state of Polytechs. But even under the previous ITO model, some of those organisations were not as financially sustainable as they needed to be. So when we're looking to evolve the system to a new place, we need to ensure that every entity is going to be financially sustainable to ensure that we can support communities and industry across the country. There is a strong focus by this government on restoring regional decision making and ensuring that Polytechs across the country can have those closer relationships with both their industry, their employers, iwi and Māori and broader communities that they support. As part of this consultation, we're also really keen to hear from industry those activities that are really valued by industry, because we know there are a breadth of things that vocational education and the tertiary system does to support industry, but what are the things that you consider to be most important? And when we're talking about Polytechs and the provision that they deliver, we are still talking about a Polytech sector that would deliver degrees, vocational, foundation, trades and trades academies. So no change there. At the same time as this consultation is occurring, there is also a group of financial advisors working with Tipakinga business divisions on understanding their current financial situation, because we know that at this point in time, there aren't any ITP business divisions across New Zealand who could immediately go to be standalone entities. So every region is going to have to make some really tough decisions and make some changes to move on a path to greater financial sustainability. And the sorts of things that those advisors are looking at are the assets and the footprints across the country, the breadth of programs being delivered, and the staffing and resourcing in those entities. So all of that work with the consultation feedback will come together to help inform the recommendations that go to the Minister that she will take to Cabinet at the end of November. So the current system, we have workforce development councils and we've got providers, but there have been some criticisms about this system in terms of it being limited in how responsive it is to regional and community needs. And so this consultation is about working with all of the stakeholders to understand what works well now and what doesn't, what maybe used to work well that you would like to take forward to the newest evolution, and what are the things that you absolutely don't want to see in the new system. So why is the change needed? Well, we've talked about the need for a financially viable system, and staying where we are today isn't an option because of those decisions that have already been made by the government. And actually going back to what it was before is also not an option, because we know there were lots of things about the old ITO structure and the individual politics which didn't work well. We had quite a lot of competition, we had some confusion, a number of industries didn't feel well supported in that model, and so going back to that isn't an option either. So we want to know, what should we take forward into the new system? Recognising there is a commitment to return autonomy to the regions rather than having a centralised system with centralised governance. We also recognise that many politics across the country are anchor institutions in those communities, especially where regions don't have direct access to a university, and that politics across the country provide those critical pathways from school into employment. So there are 3 proposals. So firstly, the creating a network by combining standalone ITPs or others together in a federation model. 2 options for industry-led system for standard setting and industry training, and then changes to funding for vocational education, because as you change the structure of the system, you need to rebalance the funding. There is no new funding, but we need to ensure that the funding is rebalanced to support the system being financially sustainable, but also that the right incentives are provided for that. So the first proposal is establishing independent regional ITPs where they can show a robust pathway to financial sustainability. And as I said, none are in that category at the moment, but we know with some decisions being made that there are some across the country that will be able to create that pathway from January 26 being stood up as independent standalone entities. But for the others, there is still a lot of work to be done to make them more financially sustainable than they are today. But to be independent requires the Minister and Cabinet to be able to sign off to say that that organisation can be independent and stand on its own 2 feet. And we know that not all of the politics across the country will be in that position, and some will require additional support, or given the scale of changes that they need to make, they would be so small in their offerings that is not going to be able to support the communities that they're operating within. So for the federation model, if we thought about all of the regional politics that are part of that model across the bottom, and you would put open politic alongside them, all of those politics would have their own council. So there would be a regional council for each politic in that model, and that council would have autonomy for the programs that are delivered to support their region. There will be, across the range of politics within that federation, some who will have access to more resources in total, like the open politic, and then there will be some smaller politics who will have less resources on the ground in their region to support some of the functions that they do. And so for those smaller ones, that regional council will have less autonomy about some of those decisions than a larger politic that has much larger access to a much larger pool of resources. Within the federation model, politics can support each other. So a politic can get support or services from any of the politics in the federation model. And we've called open politic the anchor because it has access to 160 programs online at the moment. One of the options for a regional politic, when they look at the provision that they can actually sustain in a financially sustainable way, if they want to grow that breadth of provision to be able to support their communities, one of their options is they could work with open politic to either take online programs directly, or more likely work with open politic to support a blended learning model where the core program comes from open poly, but it's supported potentially with some face-to-face tutorials and learner support on the ground in the region. But they can also get support from other polytechs. So as an example, when I was down south, Otago Polytech currently provide their midwifery program to other polytechs, such as SIT. So there is flexibility in the system. So there is governance for each single regional polytech, which gives that autonomy about what's delivered in the region. But there is also some collective governance across the top of this model, which is going to support be around financial and academic governance. The members of that collective governance group could be representatives from each of the regional polytechs, or they could be an independent group of people. Unlike Te Pukenga, there is no head office in the structure. All functions will be done within the different members of the structure. So the regional governance ensures that local decision-making occurs, but the additional support is available to support those polytechs to deliver as much provision as they can to support their communities. The sorts of questions that we're looking at with respect to this model are, what are those minimum programs and roles that are needed in a particular region? Because we know if we look at the core provision, we would hope that every polytech can deliver. That would be around things like nursing, foundation, trades academies. But what else? And for different regions across the country, and based on the communities that they're supporting, there will be other programs that are really important to them. And knowing that as part of forming the decisions that will happen over the next year is super important. And we're also expecting feedback on that two-tiered governance model. So that's the polytech sector. Okay, proposal 2. So this is about an industry-led system for standard setting and industry training. Both options here cover both of those things, but they have different configurations and different impacts for polytechs, wānanga and PTEs. And there are 2 specific changes which happen under either model. So workforce development councils currently have a broader range of functions. Under proposal 2, going forward, these functions would be reduced. We would still have standard setting, qual development, quality assurance, moderation, and a paired back workforce forecasting strategic function. But they would be the only functions that are currently within workforce development councils, which are going to move into the new model. 2 of the changes that flow out of that are that standard setters will no longer be required under legislation to provide advice to TEC to inform our investment. So that's not to say that TEC still won't work with standard setters and work with industry to understand their needs, but it will no longer be a legislated function for the new standard setting entities. The other is that workforce development councils also have broad industry coverage across every industry. But what the government has also identified is that not all industries are actively involved in vocational education and training. And so as part of the proposals, those industries which clearly have not got a significant role in vocational education and training would be supported by NZQA for their standard setting, not for arranging training, because they're there because there isn't actually any training. One of the things that we would need to ensure as part of whichever option is chosen is that there is a transition path back from being supported by NZQA, where an industry wants to now develop industry training and wants that greater support to be able to be transitioned back to be supported by the standard setting entity under either option A or option B. Once the Cabinet decide on what structure we're going for, that won't tell us how many standard setters there are. It won't tell us the exact combination of that work. That is work that we will come back and work with industry on in 2025. So determining under either option A or option B how many entities there would be. I have to stress that the diagrams that are in the consultation pack are not reflective of the final decisions being taken. They are examples. They are only examples. And so that work to agree how many new entities there are and what the combination in terms of supporting multiple industries are is all work that will be done in 2025 and will obviously be informed by the feedback that we get from industry through this process. So if I work through the two options. So option A is about establishing a small number of industry training boards who are responsible for standard setting and arranging training. So going back to a model which looks more like the old ITO model, but different, but brings standard setting and arranging training back together so that you get that feedback loop. The reason that they are different is that they will be established by the minister rather than being established by industry, and they would be public statutory bodies rather than industry-owned private bodies. But they would be industry-led in terms of industry appointing their councils, with the ability for the minister to say if the council was 8 people, the minister could appoint 2 and industry would appoint the majority of their members. So that would ensure that industry-led for the new industry training boards. So they will be responsible for standard setting and arranging training, but delivery of any off-job training would be done by providers. And we know that this was an area of tension in the old system, so there would need to be really clear guidelines between arranging and delivering training. And when we're talking about arranging training, we're talking about the entity that has the training agreement with both the employer and the employee and supports that employee for the training that they do in the workplace, but also ensures that where they can't do all their training in the workplace, that they have access to their off-job training as well. And one of the things we're really interested in hearing feedback is around online training resources and whether or not those are really related to the training you're doing on the job, or are they actually really off-job training and should be delivered by a provider rather than provided by the industry training board. Industry training boards would have clearer expectations around performance and accountability than ITOs did. So this is especially around things like ensuring that apprentices actually got through their apprenticeships, the amount of support they were getting in terms of the outcomes for the learners. The industry training organisations, we didn't have the ability to place as much in the way of performance measures on them, and so that's one thing that would change if option A is chosen. Recognising the value that we have seen from workforce development councils and the criticality of ensuring that qualifications are of a really good standard, are consistently done, are kept up to date, and are informed by industry. Under option A, the standard setting functions done by an industry training board would be funded separately from the arranging training. So arranging training is based on the number of learners that you have. In the old ITO model, especially if you are a smaller ITO and got less funding, often the standard setting work was done at varying levels of quality, especially keeping standards up to date. So the proposal is that we would fund the standard setting function separately from the arranging training. And the other thing that the government is very keen to understand is for an industry Do you just want your arranging of your training done by an industry training board? So one industry training board for your industry. Or do you want to retain flexibility for other entities, other providers to be able to support your arranging training? So currently we have 13 PTEs that support work-based training in the system. So do we want options for industry, or do they want all of their arranging training done through the industry training board? So we're very keen to get people's feedback on that. The number and shape, to Claire's question, for industry training boards, we're not expecting there to be more than 6 to 8. So this is not a situation where every industry can set up its own industry training board, recognising that the minister establishes them, not industry. And each of them needs to be financially sustainable as part of being set up. So that does provide some constraints in response to your question, Claire. Right, option B. So option B is where we stay having completely standalone industry-led bodies for standard setting, like workforce development councils, but with a narrower range of functions. And there would be a small number of those, once again, established by the minister, with councils that would be majority industry-led with a couple of ministerial appointments. Under this option, though, we would say that all providers could support industry training, and there wouldn't be a need to have a separation between arranging training and delivery training, because everybody, so Polytechs, PTEs, Wānanga, would all be able to support industry training. For the work-based learning divisions that are currently within Te Pakinga, they would be moved outside of Te Pakinga, and they would be formed into new entities. Once again, that's yet to be decided. And so those work-based learning divisions, we will work with industry about what the combination is. Once again, recognising they need to be financially sustainable, which means you need a critical mass to be able to support work-based training. Those new entities might be PTEs, but they might be some other form of public statutory body. Those are all decisions that would be made once Cabinet makes its decision on the overall structure. And we will once again be coming out to industry to talk to how many of those and how they would fit together. So the questions that we're really thinking about with respect to this is, one of the key ones is, when we move to this new system, should we have a short moratorium, maybe a couple of years, where we don't introduce any new providers, industry trainers into the system, and let the existing new entities settle down? Then the third part, the third proposal, is around funding. So there have been some decisions that have already been taken with respect to funding for 2025. So currently we fund vocational training through a delivery tuition subsidy rate, a learner component which is based on the cohort of learners a particular entity has. Are they low prior achievement, which means they haven't achieved level 3? Are they Māori, Pacifica, or disabled? So that's the second bucket. And then the third bucket is one called the strategic component, which is a non-volume based amount of funding which has been in place to support designing new programs supporting regions across the country. That strategic fund has been disestablished, and the $70 to $80 million that was in that has been moved across to increase those delivery tuition subsidy rates for provider and online-led provision. Under the unified funding system that we operate at the moment, the provider rates came down about 20%, and the extramural online rates came down even more. We're now going to bring them back to be the same, and then take them both back up about 10%, so halfway back to where the provider rates were prior to the current changes. So that happens from January 2025. From 2026, we're going to need to rebalance the system in terms of we still have the same pot of money, less the $65 million, which has been reprioritised to support from supporting workforce development councils, but we still need to fund all of the entities. We need to fund it in a way which is going to support it to be financially sustainable. And so there are some trade-offs that may be made. And even though it's one bucket of money and will create new buckets, these three things are examples of the sorts of things that might happen as a result. So firstly, if we take the funding for that delivery for provider and online back up to the rates they were before, that would probably result in a repurposing of some of that learner component funding. So that funding that's currently directly attributable to low prior achievement Māori, Pacific and disabled students. All of the funding that an entity actually receives, they need to use to support all of their learners to be successful. And the work that TEC does currently with learner success plans and providers means that we hold them to account for working to ensure that every learner achieves equitable educational outcomes, regardless of where they are studying. So that will continue and that won't change, but the different buckets they get the money from will change. The second is, for regions across the country, would it be worth having some non-volume based funding that they could use to support, Polytechs use to support their relationships with their communities and industries, and encourage those communities to be able to attract international students directly into the regions, as opposed to most of them being in Auckland. For smaller regions that have smaller polytechs, that's going to be more important because the amount of funding they get directly related to the number of learners they have will be less. And so maybe having some non-volume based funding might be a good idea to ensure they can still support their industries and communities. And then the third area would be, because we want to continue funding standard setting separately, those reduced functions, so a lower cost than workforce development councils today, we would have to repurpose some of the funding from work-based training, and those work-based training rates would come down a bit, noting that some of them went up about 50% as part of these changes for the unified funding system. So this is about a rebalancing of the funding in the system, and we're really keen to get people's views now about those particular areas to inform the work on funding next year, and then we will come out in probably about the middle of the year and talk about what's proposed for 2026. So in terms of questions, one of the ones that we're really interested in here is, what do people see as the potential impacts being on different types of students, on different industries and different businesses as a result of the funding changes? So where are we at now? So we're in consultation, which goes through to the 12th of September. One of the really important things is the sessions I've been doing around the country, and if anyone is in Rotorua, Hamilton or Tauranga next week, I'll be there running face-to-face sessions. And then there'll be online sessions for every region as well. And then we're doing these sessions obviously with industry groups, with workforce development councils, sessions with learners and sessions with Māori and iwi and Māori businesses as well as part of these changes. But these are information sharing sessions. We're, responding to questions, but for your actual feedback, it needs to be written and it needs to be submitted through the Ministry of Education website. It can be done through a template, and there's a Survey Monkey, or you can just put in your own submission, and it can be just about one point. You don't have to respond to all of the questions. It can only be about the ones that are really important to you. So once Cabinet makes its decision at the end of November, when the Minister takes her paper to them, we will then have a process of working out how do we get from where we are now to where we need to get. We will only have the structures that we're going to, but we won't know what those individual entities and what the combinations are. Once we do know that, we will, in the case of workforce development councils, be working very closely with the various leadership teams on how we support that transition to whichever the new standard setting entities are, and especially the transition of the staff that are critical to continue the functions that are going to be in the new system. The other major thing that will happen next year is we need to change legislation to be able to enact the changes. So for next year, the Te Pakinga Council are still responsible and are accountable for every business division within Te Pakinga. Workforce Development councils still have all of their accountabilities, and so we need to work through the new legislative process, which will see select committees and more consultations probably through the middle of next year, leading to a change in legislation at the end of next year, enabling the new system to stand up in January 2026. So this is where you can go. I'm sure Claire shared with you all where you can pop your feedback, and I'll stop sharing now, stop presenting, and happy to take questions.
Thank you, Gillian. That's awesome, and I can't believe how your voice has held up, given how many you've had to do so far.
I know. I'm well in the 40s now.
which means you've spent over a whole working week just talking.
I know. It's just a worry for anyone that knows me, because I am naturally an introvert. So I tell you guys, this is exhausting. No, it's all good. I'm really keen to answer any questions.
Okay, so there's some in the chat we've got one from Alice Shearman, who says, with industry training boards, if our industry hasn't had an ITO previously, does that mean we wouldn't be able to be represented through the new ITB model?
No. This is, we are setting up industry training boards, and although they look like ITOs, they're not the ITOs, and it's not just going back to the old system. So if there are industries who are now well embedded into vocational and have a clear pathway to develop training in that space, then we need to be able to ensure that we're setting up entities that can support them as part of it. So really keen to hear that in the feedback too. Yeah, and once again, the pictures and the diagrams were examples. They're not informed by actually having done any work and deciding that those are the potential ones. I think the only thing that they do is really trying to signal we aren't going to have 20 of anything. We're looking smaller rather than bigger in terms of numbers. So that's going to require industries to recognise working together, and they need to be financially sustainable. So all of those things come together, lean due towards less rather than more.
And by financially sustainable, do you mean that they can, aside from the money or the funds that are going to go to standard setting, that they can earn funds through the new funding system by taking on learners? For the industry training boards.
So industry training boards will have that arranging training function, which is the things that work-based learning divisions at Te Pakinga currently do.
Yeah. So if you don't have a student, like an apprentice, that you're receiving funding for, even if, so that really doesn't make.
No, so that's why that ITP model doesn't support well any industries that have no trainees at all in them, and that's where NZQA comes in. The second model potentially gives you a better transition path with separate standard setters, but even if you are initially still managed within NZQA, if you are then developing programs that support industry training and vocational, there has to be a pathway back into the ITBs. And this is one of the questions, do you want it only for ITBs, or do you want that ability to have PTEs or wānanga or polytechs being able to do that arranging training for you as well?
Cool. And then there's another question, are you coming to Northland to do any consultation?
I was in Northland last Friday, so I was in Whangarei, but I still will be doing a online session for Northland, and that will be on the TEC website. Sorry, I can't tell you exactly when it is, but there will be one on the TEC website saying that I'm doing it online. But I was in Whangarei last week. Yeah.
Great. Right. Open to the floor. Are there any questions from participants, please? I think the idea is that you put your question in the Q&A slot. You post. Tim Croft asks, will there be any funds available to set up new ITBs so industries not currently represented can develop them?
So ITBs will be set up by the minister, not by industry, obviously in conjunction with industry. But I think the working assumption is we're not going to have multiple ITBs. And so the ITBs that are set up need to have enough flexibility to manage a breadth of industries, just like WDCs do now. We've got some really good working examples there where we've had multiple industries coming together and are finding it actually really valuable working together rather than previously potentially only being through a narrower lens.
Okay, and Ness asks, a recent recommendation from Toi Mai was for the TEC funding redirected for the screen sector organisations to develop their own training. How would that fit into these proposals?
So that doesn't fit into these proposals. So, there are, as part of the funding that TEC receives, there are requirements on the sort of entities that funding goes to. And the only places that we currently fund are organisations that are TEOs or WDCs in terms of the role that they have in terms of developing the qualifications.
Yes, so this is the problem, Ness, that we would have to be set up as an industry training board or be part of an industry training board to receive any funds, but we couldn't receive funds if we don't have students. We can't have students if we don't have formal apprenticeships under the current model or work-based learning models, which we don't have. So we wouldn't be immediately included in an ITB. We would be in that NZQA holding pen for transition once we set these things up into some ITB or standard setter. Okay, here's another one. Victoria Blood. What research has been done in developing these proposals regarding the workforce skills and roles New Zealand will need in 10 years? The World Economic Forum 2023 Future of Jobs report says that 65% of primary school students will have a job that hasn't been invented yet.
Well, Victoria, I think that's a really good thing to feed into the feedback as a reason to consider how broad the coverage of standard setters as opposed to NZQA is. But at the end of the day, all of this comes down to the decisions that the current government make about where they want to put their money and how they're going to spend their money. And different governments have different priorities. And so this current government's working assumption is that unless industries are actively involved in industry training now, they wouldn't be part of an ITB or a standard setter, and they would be supported through NZQA, but have pathways. And so I think one of the questions is, what do we do with industries who are really keen to be involved in industry training and have shown a really strong commitment to it, but have not quite got there yet? And that is one of the questions that we have raised with the Minister and some of the advice that we've given, and absolutely a conversation that we are going to have as we work through the various stages. So really important to put that in the feedback.
Okay, another question from Johanna Smith. For the additional sector and industry engagement period, how is it decided which industries are to offer feedback and consultation? I represent the film industry, a very lucrative area for New Zealand. I assume you mean the second engagement sector engagement period after the decision is made.
So the sector engagement will be with all industries. I mean, because whatever's happening, all industries are going to be impacted by whatever the structure changes are. And so we will need, just like we did when we created workforce development councils, we will need to come out to all of industry to have those conversations. As part of that, we will probably be given some writing instructions from Cabinet about, you know, how things could be structured, but we will be coming and talking to all industries about that.
Cool. Another one from Sean Gear from the New Zealand Game Developers Association. How will the ITBs be different to WDCs? I may have tuned out in the presentation. So you might have to do another little potted explanation there.
That's all right, Sean. Gosh, really, I can't believe this isn't everyone's most important thing in their day. For an industry training board, they have two key functions. One is the standard setting, which is absolutely a lot of the work that workforce development councils currently do, but they would also have the function which is called arranging training, and that is when an entity that has the agreement with an employer and an employee for the training that employee does in their workplace. So that's what arranging training is, and we would have entities that would be responsible for that, as opposed to providers who tend to deliver it in a classroom or online. Yeah, and so providers can also do work placements or internships, but that's not work-based training because the employee is not employed in that workplace. Hopefully that makes sense.
Okay, now another one, Robin Coburn. I've heard a lot about the efficiencies and financial sustainability underpinning the proposed new system. I can't see the needs of learners being clearly articulated. Where is consideration for them reflected in these proposals?
So at the end of the day, if we don't have a financially sustainable system, then we won't be able to ensure that learners are actually getting the right level of support that they need and at the quality that they need. So ensuring that the whole system is sustainable is a really important part of providing the platform for learners. In terms of the work that the sector is doing to support learners, that is the role of TEC to ensure that that is being taken into account in all of the decisions that they're making. And we do that through the learner success plans that we have as part of their investment plan, which is part of determining how much funding they get each year. And if they're not up to scratch, then we have some really tough conversations with whichever entity it is.
Okay, question from TJ Tautua. Will the action plan for the Pacific Education 2020-30 / current tertiary education strategy still be applicable in both structures and options?
Whatever the tertiary education strategies are, they will be applicable in both structures. Both structures will need to support whatever the education strategies are.
Okay, question from Tim, another question from Tim Croft. There is mention in the proposals for industries such as technology without standard setting that consideration needs to be made for those industries without WDBL. I'm not quite sure what they mean. Yeah, I know. How will these industries be considered in the proposals? It looks currently that the proposals are for old industries and it's not innovative for emerging industries. Technology is, after all, the third biggest exporter.
Yeah, absolutely what we need to hear in the feedback, please, guys. Really important. If it doesn't come in the feedback, it's incredibly difficult for us to put that through the system in terms of recommendations. So, and we need your industries, and we need your industries to also, lobby and work with the ministers that are responsible for your industries, because at the end of the day, it's all the ministers around the cabinet table that make the decision. And as we've gone through this process, some ministers have had some very clear views and things have evolved as part of that. And so it's important to tackle based on the feedback in here, but also in terms of any opportunities to influence any of the other ministers around the table.
Yeah. Another one from Alice. What about the industries where sectors are predominantly contractors or self-employed? How will the new system support this style of career pathway, given that at the moment the system is based around employers, people who can employ people, staff?
Well, I mean, I think that's a really good thing to raise, because we have the ability under work-based training to fund those learners. The question is, it's just going to be more likely in the industry training model rather than the apprenticeship model. And recognising that the industry training model has been really declining significantly for a long period of time, one of the questions would be, is this an area where you would actually see how people envisaged industry training to look different in the future? Because it's training for industry as opposed to industry training, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then how do you do that? Where does that training come from? So I think that's a critical piece. Who is providing the environment for you to get that training? Is it provider-led training, or is it a work-based type model, or is there some new model that's required? So really keen to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and that's really relevant to a lot of our industries that we cover at Toi Mai, because they were excluded or not included in the former vocational education system. They then have set up a whole lot of informal training that they deliver themselves.
Yeah.
Now, with the last reforms, they were very keen to start being involved in more structured industry training. We haven't yet had time to develop those industry appropriate models, which aren't the old, but we haven't quite got there yet. So I think that there is a fear that we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater in this case. Okay, another few more questions. Hamish Johnson, just clarifying, option B separates funding for the standard setting and the for-profit training. Sounds like it avoids conflict of interest and addresses the needs of learners, especially in the secondary education sector.
Well, definitely option B mitigates some of the potential conflict of interest that you would get with industry training boards being the standard setter and the arranger of training, especially if other entities were supporting arranging training. It's in the option B that separation of standard setters would potentially mean that you could empower them more to ensure consistency and national consistency across the country in the delivery of the training to support industry. But that is the role of the standard setter, to ensure that national consistency, because that is also one of the questions. Because there's a lot in the proposals about regional autonomy, but ITBs and standard setters are both national entities. They're not regional entities.
Okay, we're just about out of time. Rhonda has asked a similar question to Alice about the screen sector being self-employed. So I think you've answered that question. Robin Coburn asks, how will the proposed system accommodate volunteers as learners, e.g. sports coaches and officials?
So there are options in terms of the rules for funding that volunteers can be funded, whereas previously under the old system they weren't. I don't think there's no intention in these proposals to change that. But if there were any changes, that would come part of the changes on funding that would be consulted in the middle of 2025.
Okay, another one from Ness. No mention about where funding for research and data for quality of training, relevance to industry and learner outcomes. This has been a major oversight for Screen in the past. Will this be included in each option? So I guess that's all the data and insights, workforce insights we gather now.
Yeah, and I think that part of that is, how does that fit into that workforce forecasting strategic function, and how big or small is that?
Yep. And from Marin, from Te Mahi Ako Skills Active, kia ora, Gillian. The active recreation, leisure and entertainment sector have been well supported through industry training models over the past 30 years across the various reforms, with various models of industry led. What does good industry leadership look like in your view? Big question.
Big question. Well, I think it is, for me, strong industry leadership in this space is industries that are really engaged and have really clear ideas about what they want and what they don't want, and are able to communicate those. I think that's the critical piece, because the system can only respond when it really understands what an industry's need is. And if we're not, where we have these disconnects, then we need to find ways, how do we better communicate with industries? And so workforce development councils, or the standard setters of the function, though, that engagement between those entities is super important. And one of the reasons why that's one of the things we monitor for WDCs now, because we need to ensure that they're reflecting what their industries actually think, and that their industries feel that they have a voice.
Okay, last question from Sue Edwards. How are entrepreneurs supported in all this? Is that MB's role more? Most of our successful innovators on the global stage have come from traditional vocational occupations, some early in career.
Yeah, I don't think this particular set of consultations is really going to support or not support the entrepreneurs of the future. I think that is something that is identifying who those people are and creating opportunity is probably something like MBs or separate programs run.
Yep. Okay, so Suzette has asked, will you be providing a copy of your presentation, Gillian? We will certainly be making the webinar available on our website this afternoon for people to share. I don't know whether you've got a separate, is your presentation separate as well?
I can send you a copy of the slides. Yep, I can do that. In fact, I think you've probably already got one.
I think we probably do somewhere.
I thought if you can't find it, Claire, let me know. Yep. But I'm pretty sure we sent it to you guys after we did our initial briefing.
Ago. Yeah,
I know.
So we'll post that. We'll post that separately, and then we'll put this webinar online as well.
Yeah. Cool.
Somebody's sneaking in. How stringently will the 3 proposals be applied as is, or will they look to adapt them based on consultation?
Absolutely look to adapt them. I mean, you could end up with something that's a combination of A and B very easily. Through that process, because that's what consultation's about, and they've been kept in some areas high level to be able to the next level of detail come post consultation.
Yeah, and I think that that's the really important thing, is that the only way you can make sure that your industries are needs are factored into this proposal, the reform process, is by making a submission. And so as Gillian said before, the discussion here doesn't form part of the consultation process. You need to fill in the forms or submit to the Ministry of Education, as Gillian indicated earlier. All right, thank you everybody for joining us today for this webinar, for being part of the process, for hopefully making lots of submissions, because boy, do we need to have our voices heard in this process if we don't want the system to just revert to old models and old industry needs. So because we represent newer industries, growth industries, really important industries, we need to be part of the process. I'm just going to hand back to Tama to close us off, but say thank you to everybody, and thank you very much, Gillian, for your time.
Not a problem.
Yeah, and if I tell just Kia ora tātou. Here we go. Technology again, wonderful. I just want to tail off as to what Claire just said. Thanks again, Gillian. Sorry that we're not in person. I know I was following you around there for a little while, but I'm sure we'll see each other in another hui, given that there's a lot more mahi to be done around this kaupapa. Firstly, thank you to each and every one of you for giving up your time and coming along. And I just want to reiterate what Claire said. It's really, really important that you put your whakaaro in a submission and send it through. The more voices we have contributing to ensure that the perspective from our industries is heard, the better. We don't want to be subsumed back into the cloud that once was, now that we're poking out the other side. So mākua whakakapi ai po tātou nei hui huinga. He mihi anō kia tātou i whakaputa pātai mai. me ngā kōrero I whakatakoto he e koe, Gillian, mō tēnei kaupapa whakahirehire ki a ngai tātou katoa. Nā reira, ka kare ki a tātou. Kia tau ngā manakitanga o te wāhi ngaro, ki runga ki tēnā, ki tēnā o tātou, kia māhe tahu mā ki hiki, kia toi te kupu, toi te mana, toi te aroha, toi te reo Māori, turuturu o whiti whakamaua kia tīna, haumi e hui e, tā ki e. Tēnā koutou katoa.
Thanks everyone.